Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. Well, today, two of my favorite people who have now written my new favorite book called Breaking Point, The New Shifts Putting Canada at Risk. Darrell Bricker, John Ibbitson, have been writing about this theme together and separately for quite some time now, that there's a shift away from the Laurentian elites, the old Ottawa, Montreal, Toronto connection, and to the West. But then there seems to be such a profound resistance from the Laurentian elite to give up the power that they've so long held. So Darrell, as you know, is the global CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs, and John Ibbitson is a name and a face you know because he's been a political journalist and an author for more than 30 years, and you see him all over the place on the media as well, including on this podcast. So we're really going to delve in. I was saying to John just a moment ago that you had me when you did quoted the Leonard Cohen song, that there's a crack in everything and it's how the light gets in. And it is actually a metaphor for everything, but it does matter when you're talking about a country that you two have concluded may well be at its breaking point, because the light gets in, it allows you to see it, but then what's your answer? Are you going to build and react, or are you going to manage the decline? Darrell, why don't you start?
Well, for me, that was a great metaphor too. But the other metaphor I have was actually from another book that was written on a similar topic many, many years ago, called Lament for a Nation by George Grant. And he asked one really important question in the book, and that is, are Canadians a unique species on the North American continent? So for me, when we started into this book, that was the question that was on my mind, because in fact, that's what Donald Trump was asking.
Mm-hmm.
Was saying, why do we have this border? Why does this exist? What is the explanation as to why we are not one unified continent? And I thought that was an interesting challenge to take on.
Yeah.
And George Grant had identified it, I think, correctly back in the 1960s. So really, when we started into this book, that was what my mind was. Okay, what can we say about the country that talks about what makes us a unique species on the North American continent, and what are the big shifts that are taking place in our country that could jeopardize that?
John, jump in. Let's hear what your motivation was.
Well, I think we've always had a reason for being. We've certainly at least had a reason for a way of evolving. And the way that we evolved over the course of since Confederation was what I have called a culture of accommodation, a way of getting along with each other by, as much as possible, leaving each other alone, respecting each other's space, and cooperating when when it was necessary for us to all work together. That allowed the French and the English to live together in the same political space, even though they had been warring in Europe for centuries. And it became a great template for multiculturalism, allowing people from all parts of the world to come into Canada, that live and work and share in the country while also respecting their own cultures and their own traditions. It has been the formula for one of the most successful countries in the world. But as we say in the book, Darrell and I believe that there are stresses that we have not addressed, cans that we have kicked down the road. And to completely mix the metaphor, the chickens are now coming home to roost. And in some ways, Donald Trump, although he is poses one of the greatest challenges that this country has ever faced, is in some ways a catalyst. He is forcing us to look square in the face of challenges and problems that have been dividing the country for years and that we've tried to ignore. We can't ignore them anymore, and it's time to confront them, and that's what Breaking Point is all about.
You've used a phrase there that we've become one of the greatest countries in the world, but yet you also say in the book that Canada long lives with some kind of strategic illusion. You know, our foreign policy is based on mythology that we're the world's peacekeepers and the world comes to us ask for our moral advice. I'm not sure that's true. Did you come to that conclusion?
Oh, it is absolutely the case. Look, again, as we've talked about in the past and in the book, Canada has a proud tradition in war and in peace. We fought in great wars on the winning side. We established the peace, helped to establish the peace that gave the world no great power war for 80 years and counting. We were, instrumental in inventing, in inventing and launching the idea of peacekeeping.
Mm.
But we have been for decades now underinvesting in our defenses. And defense policy is foreign policy, is trade policy. That's something we say over and over again in the book. If you weaken your defenses, then your voice doesn't carry as much weight in the councils of the world. And indeed, it becomes even harder for you to buy and sell to other nations. So we do believe that Canada has in some sense lost its voice in the world, and we pay a high price for it. And especially now when we realize that the Americans aren't always going to be our protectors, and
Yep.
indeed, in some respects, they could be turning into an adversary.
Darrell, I want to go to you because, as you write in the book, Canada is not a love story. It is a marriage of convenience, a survival strategy conceived a century and a half ago for a collection of colonies that were determined to protect their autonomy from America's manifest destiny. Bear with me, I'm going to carry on. Since the first grand bargain of Confederation, Ottawa and the provinces have lurched about like awkward dance partners stumbling over obstacles, arguing endlessly over who should take the lead. The result is a nation held together not by shared vision, but by barely managed tensions, which goes to the core of your question. What is our raison d'etre? Why do we exist?
And that really is the question. Back in 1867, we knew why we existed, and that's because we were part of the British Empire. And whether Quebec wants to acknowledge that or not, I mean, that was the reason that the country came together. We figured that we were better together than we were joining the United States. And, over the years, I think what's happened is we've lost that sense of how it came together, why we came together. Now, interestingly enough, Donald Trump has rekindled
Yeah,
what the reason
exactly.
was as to why we came together. But just as we had great challenges to confront in order to make that work back in the 1860s and up into the 20th century, we continue to have these great challenges to keep this country together and to find that harmony that you need in order to keep a country united and feeling like it is better in the situation that we have today than any other type of situation. And what I do worry about is I think there's this perception. And it's interesting. I was watching John. I do watch John when he was on a panel
On TV?
on TV. And one of the commentators said, because John kind of mentioned some of the things that we're talking about today, and the person said, "Well, I think I'm just going to go back to bed." And I think that that's the problem that we've got right now, where
Yep.
people think that this is just we've kind of woken up in this little bit of a bad dream, and we can just go to bed and sleep it off, and then tomorrow we'll get up and everything will be back to being the same. And no, it won't. I mean, Donald Trump just basically pointed out what the realities of Canada are and how difficult it is to keep this country together by asking two fundamental questions. One, if you can't defend yourself, what kind of a country are you? And two, if all of your economy is dependent on one economy, what kind of a country are you?
Yeah.
Well, those are two very real questions for anybody that's worried about national sovereignty. So rather than just going back to bed and
Yeah.
pretending that it's a bad dream that we're going to wake up from, what John and I said is, it's time to start taking these things on in a spirit of understanding that we've done this before and we can do it again.
We can do it again. I want to back into the election, but all of us have been, of course, watching the events unfold in the Middle East and the meeting last week between the president and the prime minister. So we went through this elbows up. Carney, clutched the election out of the hands of Pierre Poilievre because of Donald Trump setting up the stage for him. But now, when we witness Mark Carney tell Donald Trump he's transformational, jump on a plane and go to the Middle East yesterday, and stand there to shake his hand when, in fact, just a week or so ago, we were insisting on recognizing a Palestinian state that Marco Rubio said nearly scuttled the deal. And then to your point about defense, Darrell didn't have a plane, had to charter a plane to get from one venue to another. Why don't you start, John, on that?
Yeah, in some ways, it's even more depressing than when we started writing the book. So we wrote a breaking point very quickly. We started
Yeah.
it in December. We finished it for all intent and purposes in June, although we were still making editions as late as August. And at the time we started writing, we had this remarkable situation where Justin Trudeau had resigned, Mark Carney had become prime minister, and he had declared that the relationship with the United States that had existed for so many decades was over. And that we needed to find a new way of governing, a new way of running our economy, elbows up and all of that. And people were talking about this surge of national unity. Well, where did it all go?
Yeah.
The eternal free trade agreement that everyone said we were going to negotiate in order to sell to ourselves if we couldn't sell to the United States. I don't see much in the way of concrete results in terms of that agreement. The major infrastructure projects that were going to allow us to send our products, oil and gas and minerals and everything else overseas to Europe and to the Pacific if we couldn't sell it to the United States. Where are those announcements? Instead, all we have already is a fight between Alberta and British Columbia over a possible pipeline. It's as though we had elbows up for about 15 minutes, and then, yes, we went back to bed. But we don't have time for this. The situation is very grave. It was grave before Donald Trump became president. It's even worse now. The tensions that we'll talk about that are regional, that are generational, the major issues that we have not been confronting, these have to be addressed. And if they're not addressed, then the country's future will be very much at risk.
Darrell, just your thoughts on that as well, that what happened to elbows up. And we, Donald Trump doesn't forget things. So he may shake Mark Carney's hand, but he'll also remember that he recognized a Palestinian state. He joked in their meeting and called him president, and then said, "Well, it could have been governor, but I elevated you." And even by Mark Carney himself saying, "Thanks for elevating me to president." I always get offended when we do that. I think there's nothing wrong with the prime ministership. Anyway, some thoughts, Darrell.
Well, first of all, Mark Carney is not a politician.
Yeah.
I mean, and anybody who watched him on the campaign trail and watches him in the House of Commons every day knows that these are not his skills. But he did claim that he had certain Churchillian ambitions during the course of the election campaign. And the interesting thing is Churchill never met with his antagonist during the Second World War. In fact, what he did was he rallied his own nation around him. And they created what was necessary in order to achieve victory. So while I'm certainly always intrigued when I see the Prime Minister meet with the President of the United States, and he has to obviously do this. I mean, the real challenge of being a Prime Minister in this day and age is really the one that John A. Macdonald confronted, not Churchill. I mean, John A. Macdonald had to bring together these constantly warring colonies that existed on this side of the 49th parallel in a way that said that they could ultimately become a nation by finding ways to create best interests for everybody that was involved. And nobody got actually a full glass. Everybody got a half glass, but he was so focused on relationships and building relationships with people and putting together compromises that would create the infrastructure that we needed, first political, and then after that, things like the National Railway and other things that we had to create in this country to be able to create this country. And it wasn't because he was the smartest guy in the room.
Right.
It wasn't because he did a great job talking about things with the President of the United States. He found a way of uniting people around a single mission, which was to be a nation, by not putting his elbows up, but maybe putting his arms around what this Canadian future was going to be. So while we love to knock down John A. Macdonald's statue, and he's not exactly the most au courant political figure in Canada these days, and maybe we can get back to a more reasonable reckoning with the legacy of John A. Macdonald, which is a complicated one. There's no doubt about that. And we say this in the book. Let's take a moment to realize the skills that he used to bring this country together, and they weren't being antagonistic towards our neighbors. They weren't about, as I said before, being the smartest guy in the room.
Yeah.
They were about building relationships and bringing people together. And that's the challenge that Mark Carney is going to confront. This is a very, very difficult country to govern.
Yeah.
So does he have those necessary skills? And that's what we're going to test over the space of the next couple of years.
That railway that John A. Macdonald built and his wife rode on the cow catcher at the front of the train to celebrate this development. It may be the last great national project infrastructure that we ever build. It troubles me, John, because even in this discussions about the pipelines and whether they're south or east-west, you see the federal government once again walking away and saying, well, BC and Alberta should work that out. It doesn't have anything to do with us. It has everything to do with them.
Yeah, and it's not an either or. Excuse me. It's not either we let British Columbia and Alberta work it out between themselves, and if they don't, well, we shrug our shoulders. Or the federal government imposes a pipeline on everybody else and just says, we have this within our constitutional authority, we're going to do it. Again, as Darrell said, Canada doesn't work that way. Canada works well when we find ways to compromise, when we accommodate each other's interests, when not everybody gets what everybody wants, but everybody gets enough that they can live with this solution. And that's going to have to be the case here. We do need major infrastructure. We do need to reorient our economy. We do need to rebuild our military and reshape our foreign policy. But we need to do it not by having a strong prime minister save the country. We all have to be a part of it. And we have to recognize that it's a federation, and the federal and provincial governments have to work together in solving these problems. And you can't just say they have to work it out, or you can't just say, I'm going to impose it upon you. We have to negotiate our way through, find compromises, and get things done. And that's hard. And because it's hard, too often we just shrug and say, well, we won't bother to do it at all. But that's no longer the case. That's no longer an option for us.
We saw that in the Constitution when, for better or worse, I mean, here Elliott Trudeau was a strong and determined person, and those of us who lived in the West put up with the NEP, and it seared into our brains. But when he decided he wanted the Charter of Rights, he also realized that he was up against strong premiers, and a compromise needed to be worked out. It's called the notwithstanding clause, which is why we have a Charter of Rights. So you do need to find those compromises, but somebody has to lead, Darrell.
Well, and those will be the skills, and they're not the skills, as I said before, being the smartest person in the room. They're the skills of somebody who's able to build relationships, like politicians who lead coalitions and are dealing with difficult circumstances in the House of Commons or whatever. The things that make you good as a politician should be the skills that you use to bring this together. Unfortunately for Mr. Carney, these are things that he's learning on the job right now. And so it's not about, being you're not in a boardroom as the chairman of a board of directors telling people what to do. That's not the way this country works. It was created as a federation for a reason. It wouldn't exist if it wasn't created in this type of federation. So he's going to have to learn along with his cabinet and along with the rest of his government, and frankly, also along with the leaders of the opposition parties too, and the premiers, to make this system of compromise that constitutes Canada work in our national interest. Because as John said quite correctly, and I heard him say this on TV the other day, and I completely agree with him, we don't have time. Yeah. We don't have time. We need to work on these things now.
I'm with you. I mean, this is why I think the book really grabbed me, because I think the timing is crucial. I'm not even sure we have time to wait 2 weeks on this, never mind, anything longer. Trace for us, and John, I'll go to you on this, just your original point about the big shift where you saw the power moving to a more economic base in Western Canada. That kind of got stalled. a bit, but it is just a reality. It is what is happening in this country. Yet we're seeing this resistance. Quebec, there'll never be a pipeline through our province. BC, there'll never be a pipeline, to the coast, to Tidewater. And that's just one issue, but it is kind of pitting that old elite against the new power brokers.
Yeah, in the original book, The Big Shift, which came out in 2013, I believe, we talked about what we saw as a great demographic and political shift underway in the country. That was the rising power and influence of the West as more and more people moved there, as its economies grew more powerful, as it became the most dynamic region in the country. And along with that, the great shift in immigration to countries from India and China and other parts of the developing world. Many of whom lived in these vast suburbs outside of Toronto and outside of Vancouver, who tended to be more socially and economically conservative than many of the native born. And we said that those two factors will create a stable conservative coalition, something that Canada has never had at the federal level before, a stable conservative coalition that will challenge its progressive counterparts, which we said might be the Liberal and the NDP working together, or one party becoming dominant, or another. Now, and in that sense, everything in the Big Shift turned out to be true. The Conservatives have been competitive in every election. They won the popular vote in 2019 and 2021. They secured 41% of the vote last April, which normally gets you a majority government. It just happened that the Liberals got even more. And so all of those things are happening. What we didn't get, what we missed in the original book, was that these shifts were going to further strain the Federation. That the rising power of the West, confronted by the Laurentian elites in central Canada, a rising sense of anger and frustration in Alberta and Saskatchewan, especially with central Canada, and a failure to recognize any of that by the power elites in Toronto, Montreal, and Ottawa have put the country under enormous strain. That is one of the two great fractures that has put the country at risk. The other one is more generational and regional. But certainly, we have got to find a way to accommodate the shifting powers and demographics of this country in a way that accommodates and respects the western part of the country, because if we don't, separation may not come from Quebec, it may come from Alberta.
Darrell, you and I talk about this all the time with your polls and when we elections and all the rest of it. I mean, what you say about that shift and it being real and there has to be an acceptance of it, we're not seeing the acceptance of it. We're seeing a huge resistance to what is a natural flow where we are a resource-based economy. It means that the West is going to be a powerful partner, but they're not being treated that way.
And every day, in every way, Daniel Smith becomes a more important politician in this country because Alberta becomes a more important part of our economy.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing, if you take a look at the trade statistics over the space of the last 6 months, every month, the amount of oil and gas exports going to the United States is the only part of our economy that's actually increasing in terms of exports. So every day, the leverage for Alberta and by that, in association, Saskatchewan continues to grow. But what the problem is that we don't have our national institutions really recognizing. So one of the things that we do argue about in the book, we don't argue about it, we just present the idea, is that maybe there needs to be a bit of a rebalancing of our institutions in the way the country is being governed. But the truth is that, the Liberals really only won one election. That was 2015. The other two, they needed to basically govern in coalition with the NDP. So my view is that the Progressives have basically are together anyway. The way we describe it in the book is it's like living together rather than a formal marriage. But in all respects, that's basically what it is. But we're moving into these two different power bases with different geographic centers. And as John said, this is not good for the unity of the country.
No, and I mean, you see this reflected in institutions like the media as well, that, I mean, the way that they describe Daniel Smith or the Western yahoos that are out there thinking they can, in a landlocked area just team up with America. Like it is heard very differently here, believe me, in terms of when people just toss off a line like that. I was interested actually in what you were just talking about, Darrell, in terms of your assessment of the election. You were talking about, and I don't know if I'm saying this right, but John, I'll go to you. The Maurice Duverger, a French political scientist who's had theories about this in the 1950s about how the left kind of joins up and what that means. They may have their passions about the environment or about whatever it is, but when it comes to voting, they kind of go to the middle of the ground and vote liberal, and then and it keeps the conservatives out by a hair time after time after time.
Yeah, although I'm not sure that's actually been the case in more recent history. I think if you look back as far as Mulroney, you find that there's been a greater balance between conservative and liberal governments.
Yeah,
What we
they're
have
close.
always,
Yeah.
yeah, what we have always maintained is that at both the provincial and the federal level, it is inevitable that the progressive movement will move together into a single political space. Again, whether that takes the form of coalition governments, or it takes the form of political mergers, or just takes the form of one party going extinct. We think that that process is underway, and you only need to look at the provinces to see that. There is no liberal party to speak of in the western provinces. In fact, I believe the only liberal government in the country right now, provincially, is Newfoundland and Labrador, assuming that they win
The election
the next
results.
provincial election. So you have a strange situation
Well,
now where,
New Brunswick has a liberal government.
Oh yeah, New Brunswick. Yeah.
oh, sorry, New Brunswick,
Yeah.
yes, of
Yeah.
course. Um,
Thank you,
so
Jim.
you have a situation where, for the most part, you have you have a strong NDP governments at the provincial level, and a very strong Liberal government at the federal level, and the NDP is in dire straits after the last election. So there is going to be a de facto tendency towards a conservative coalition and a progressive coalition at both the federal and the provincial level, and we see that playing out.
But in our first past the post system, Darrell, and there we all are on election nights watching this. Once the vote is over with downtown Toronto and downtown Montreal, it's actually just a numbers game. I mean, they can win if those urban seats are secured and a bonus from Vancouver. How can it ever be different?
Well, it can be different if somebody's able to put together the coalition that Stephen Harper put together, which is winning the 905 around the city of Toronto. And the Conservatives made a lot of progress on that in the last
Yeah.
election campaign. So if they're able to do that, then quite clearly they've got a chance to win, just as Stephen Harper did. And in fact, a better chance to win today than when Stephen Harper won. But the tragedy in all of that, of course, is only Stephen Harper only won 5 seats in the province of Quebec. So yes, it's the Conservatives win, but where does that leave the province of Quebec? Stephen Harper did poorly in Atlantic Canada. Where does that leave Atlantic Canada? Stephen Harper did poorly in the downtowns of the major cities, with the exception of Calgary. And so you sit back and you say we're dividing into these two groups, progressive and conservative, but neither one of them really constitute what you would say is a truly representative coalition of regions in the country.
It does lead you to wonder that, even in a two-party system, how that ever resolves itself so that people feel represented. I mean, we keep coming back to the basic question. And one of the things that's changing that is, and we don't know how it will really, is the whole question of immigration, both legal and illegal, and temporary foreign workers and the whole thing. Everybody remembers when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau mused that Canada had no core identity. There was no mainstream in Canada anymore. And certainly in the part of the world that I come from, people just really bristled in the strongest possible way to that. And the immigration is changing, and because we have that mosaic mindset, which is have the separate groups as opposed to the melting pot, which is put the American flag on your forehead and do what you want with your own cultural groups on the weekend. It does kind of intensify the differences. John, do you want to take a stab at that?
Well, look, this has always been, and Dell and I have maintained in the past, in fact, a great competitive advantage for Canada, that we have been able to bring in very high levels of immigration at a time when fertility rates around the world are plunging. For the replacement rate of 2.1 children per woman is required to stabilize a population. Our fertility rate is down to 1.25 now, I think. So the only way we, along with other developed countries, are able to sustain and even grow our population is by bringing in immigrants. And we have always done that. We've done it well. And even better, there has been a consensus within the country that immigration is good and more immigration is better. One of the great challenges facing the country, one of the great fractures, and indeed perhaps the biggest crisis that this country faces right now, is that we've lost that consensus. Partly as a result of a flood of asylum claimants coming in across the border, mostly as a result of the last Liberal government's decision to open the floodgates for temporary foreign workers and international students. All of a sudden, we had 3 million non-permanent residents in Canada, and they were competing for jobs with young people. They were competing. They were causing housing prices to go up. They were putting a strain on the healthcare system. And suddenly you had most Canadians saying, you know what, there are too many immigrants coming into the country. And it wasn't racism. They're right. There were too many immigrants coming into the country. So one of the things we absolutely have to get back on track with is getting our immigration system under control, making sure that the asylum claim process is real and swift and believable and trustworthy. That temporary foreign workers are only brought in when there is no Canadian worker available or an employer who's not willing to pay a decent living wage for a native-born Canadian. And we need to get that sense of confidence in the immigration system back. If we don't, then we will have lost the biggest single asset we had as a country.
But I mean, Darrell, you see this all of the time. I mean, that consensus has broken down. It's yes, pressures on hospitals and schools and housing and all of that. But increasingly, what I'm hearing is the question is not just about how many come in, but who is coming in. Great influx, because there's different interests, but certainly the Muslim presence has increased, and we've seen that on the streets and the university campuses, whether those are people who are some of them paid to be there or whether they are bringing the issues from the home country. Like this is starting to really divide. I don't know a nicer way to put it.
Well, it's all relative, Senator. I mean, if you compare Canadians on these questions to Americans and Brits, and John and I wrote a piece in the Global Mail last week on just this. I mean,
Yeah.
really, when you're taking a look at the Canadian situation, the objection of Canadians is basically management as opposed to culture, although there are cultural elements to it. And I would say, we have to be careful about what is allowed to come into the country. If people are unable to leave behind the tensions that they participated in, or were pushed out by, and bring them to the country, and they're protesting every weekend downtown and shutting down
Yeah.
things all over the place, and particularly when they're not also aligning with things that we recognize in our Charter of Rights, or and what we respect in terms of women's rights and other things in this country. There are going to be issues, and I think the immigration system should be taking those sorts of things into account. Not just because I think it should be that way, but when you go out and you survey Canadians on this, they think it should be taken into account as well. Now, to be clear, I mean, we're in a very specific moment. We'll see what happens as a result of what happened in Israel over the space of the last
Right.
couple of days. I mean, if things die down and the protests start to go away, then we move back to having, I would say, a less concerned from a cultural perspective type of conversation about immigration. But those issues about how we run the system will continue on. And most people who are concerned about immigration in this country are concerned about the effect that it's having on the things that John was mentioning before. They're also concerned about integration and whether or not people are
Yeah.
able to integrate successfully in our society and being able to live in the Canadian promise that they were made when they were given the opportunity to be here. So I think that hopefully what we're going to see is a decline in some of those other things that have become irritations. And if they don't decline, don't I'm worried about what's going to happen here. I mean, quite accepting cultures in other places have really struggled with this too. The Nordic countries being a good
Right.
example. So we have to be very careful on these things. But I'm hoping that what we're going to see is a decline of some of the tension in the Middle East. And when that happens, maybe we can get back to some of these questions that I think are more, let's say, less cultural and more administrative and management oriented, which I think are the kinds of things that Canadians really want to address anyway.
Yeah, but it ties in very tightly with this whole growing concern about crime in this country. And when you see people on the streets parading and shutting down businesses and blocking traffic and ambulances and everything else, and there appears to be no prosecution, then that becomes it kind of melds with a whole other concern that Canadians already have.
Well,
Darrell,
Yeah.
go ahead, Joe.
okay.
Um, I mean, we have to be careful here that we don't misinterpret what's going on. Um, Canada brought in the Trudeau government promised and executed. I think it was something like 60,000 Syrian refugees during that crisis. And it was a crisis. They were refugees, and Canada was right to accept them, just as Canada was right to accept the Vietnamese boat people
Right.
back
But
in the
there's been a lot
1980s.
since. That's the other.
But the fundamentals of immigration have to remain what they've always been, which is entirely selfish. Our immigration system works because it's a selfish immigration system. It goes out and it finds the very best people, those who are best educated, who have the most skills, who can speak English and French, and who are needed by our economy, and we bring those people in. When the immigration system is working, and yes, it has not been working now for several years, but when the immigration system is working, you don't have a problem of great cultural clashes, because what you have is 250, 300, 400,000 people a year coming in, almost all of whom are coming in because they have the skills needed in order to contribute to our society. And if we do that, then the cultural integration problem will dissipate, will evaporate. We have to be careful, though, that we don't let that system be swamped by hundreds of thousands of people coming to Canada and claiming asylum who may not, in fact, integrate well within our society.
Yeah. And there is a lot of that. Darrell, do you have a thought on that just before we change topics?
Yeah, the irony in all of this is that you would expect that this would have all transpired under a conservative government, and you see
Yeah.
all this tension on immigration. In fact, it was one of the things that Justin Trudeau really embraced. And by the way, if you read the chapter on the Trudeau government, we're not especially kind to what the last decade has been about. And this is one of those things, and I agree with John. When you look back at it, if anybody should have been able to manage it well, because of who they are, it should have been the Liberals,
Yeah.
party of downtowns in urban Canada, and that's where immigration is basically an urban phenomenon in this country. They should have been able to deal with it, but managed it poorly, I think, from an objective perspective. And the reason that we know that is because Mark Carney and the Liberal Party, our new Prime Minister, and his new government have been tacking back on this as hard as Pierre Poilievre ever would have. So that's enough evidence
Yeah,
for
we'll see the numbers. We'll see if the numbers change. There's rhetoric for sure. Darrell, let me stay with you because, not surprisingly, you write about the impact of COVID and the government's response and the truckers and the whole thing. And I've got to say, and my apologies, I did not know this happened, but of course it happened to many people in COVID, that you actually lost a brother to cancer in the middle of this situation in a hospital where you couldn't see him and couldn't talk to him and couldn't reach him. And 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 I know 100 cases in my own life and what we did to the kids and to the elderly and to the sick and dying. It's pretty profound, and the scars, I think, are still there and deep. Just talk to
Yeah,
me a little
no,
bit about that.
I think that's all true. I mean, I don't think my situation was unique. I think, as you said, a lot of people went through it. It was tragic at the time, but it certainly opened my eyes up to how draconian the whole system had become, and how
Yeah.
little thought had actually been given
Yeah.
to the effects of what was going on. And what we say in the book, is that we didn't really learn as much as we should have going through this process. What we discovered was that it was something that infected generally and killed specifically, and we didn't respond. Our institutions didn't respond especially well to this situation. And the Prime Minister's leadership, you have to give him credit because, as we do in the book, to say that Canada did better than most countries in terms of being able to deal with this. But the scars that were left behind by this, particularly because he decided to turn it into a wedge issue, even
Yeah.
called it an election baseline. It was a very, very cynical
Yeah.
political position that he took. So, when it should have been a triumph, by doing these kinds of things, he really left it a very bitter taste in the mouth of an awful lot of Canadians, and I think we're still suffering from it today.
We,
And this is one of the things that really undermines central authority in this country and what people think about the federal government, what they even think about things like expertise, and what they think about the motivations of our political leaders. I mean, we really went through the ringer on this, and I don't think that we've come out any drier.
I
Let me
mean,
put it that
John,
way.
one of the things we saw was a real authoritarian streak. We saw it everywhere, but this, whether it was the Emergencies Act or mandates and why the truckers were in Ottawa in the first place had to do with their livelihoods, and their ability to cross borders. But even that was, to use the phrase, weaponized. And that's still a very big tension between the regions too. I mean, Western Canada does tend to be a little bit more freedom loving and rights and less responsive to institutions telling them with good reason, because as we learned across the world, what was once a conspiracy theory became fact in this case, but also in others. So how do we, I mean, that's a very huge hurdle, as Darrell says.
Yeah, we said at the beginning of the show that that Donald Trump was in some ways a catalyst for problems that had been festering for a long time. Another word might be trauma. Donald Trump's presidency was a trauma inflicted on Canada. COVID was a trauma in the same way. And yes, we did do better than most other countries in terms of protecting people. But yes, we also polarized opinions and revealed as well how much loss of trust there is in our political institutions, in leadership, in elites, and again, how much intergenerational tension there is as well between older people who essentially the entire society was geared to protecting them from COVID, and young people who paid the price of that.
Mm.
Students who didn't get to go to school, and people who lost their jobs. So it was a COVID, like Donald Trump, were two traumas inflicted on a system that was already weakening, and that's why we say the place could be at risk of fracture.
But some of the repercussions of that, and maybe I'm off base here, but the whole argument about science is settled, which was shown not to be the case. Science was not settled. We were learning as we went through this, has seemed to have an impact on the climate issue and on the green issue. If people are doubtful about science being settled on COVID, they're getting a little more doubtful. And this in the context of Donald Trump too, where he is challenging all of that, and that's affecting business decisions. I know that's a lot of sentences, Darrell, but jump on it.
Well, what I think is that we're going to look back at 2019 prior to getting into COVID as being the good old days. And that a lot of things like, for example, institutional certainty that we used to
Yeah.
be prepared to give up. We would listen to authority because we believed authority knew what it was doing and had our best interests in mind and was going to only do the things that it needed to do in order to control, say, for example, like a pandemic, and that they would be taking into account a more sophisticated understanding of the public interest. I think that was blown up as a result of what we went through. Now, Donald Trump's taking it into a whole new direction, which is, what I say is the truth rather than
Yeah.
any sort of considered scientific debate. But science had its triumphs through the course of COVID, but I don't think that the degree of acceptance of authority and expertise is going to be. It's kind of like Humpty Dumpty. It's fallen off of the fallen off of the wall, and it's going to be very hard to put it back together again because there's just too many examples in which things turned out not to be what we were told. And I remember we were sort of glorifying and lionizing people who were working in the public health system back then. We've been giving them orders of Canada and everything else. And it's like, the public's not really thinking that they were that great heroes that maybe some of the people who are in positions of authority think they were great heroes. I think that there's a lot of discussion that's going to take place over time on exactly what happened. But the actual book that can be objective about this, very difficult to write right now because everything is so raw.
Yeah.
There's, in terms of climate change, which you referenced, Senator, there's something else going on as well. Darrell and I have also written about this in the past. The environment is something that people worry about when there's nothing else to worry about. When the economy is sound and people have jobs, we have to worry about something, so we worry about the environment. Now, this is not in any way to mitigate the dangers of global warming and the importance of reducing our carbon emissions, not in the slightest. But it is also true at the same time that the global warming issue was a massively important issue up until the economy went into crisis at the time of COVID, and all of a sudden the global warming issue receded. What was the first thing that Mark Carney did as Prime Minister? Literally, the first thing he did was he canceled the carbon tax, the consumer carbon tax, and you just feel it on the street. Yes, people are still worried about global warming. Yes, especially when the haze settles in the air because of all the forest fires in the West. Even people in central Canada recognize that there's something bad going on, and we have to do something about it. But right now, I would say it's the issue is not converting to EVs. The issue is whether we can hold on to an automotive industry. That's an economic issue, not an environmental issue, and I think that's taking place as well.
No, that it's just, I guess, what I'm concerned about, given Mark Carney's history and what he's dedicated his time and energy to. I've read the book, but his work on with through Davos and the World Economic Forum and whatnot. He was kind of a leader on the whole issue of climate finance and altering behavior by controlling the financial levers. Can we move quickly enough to respond? This is back to this issue that we started with, which is Donald Trump's put it all in pretty sharp relief. And we're going to look through the cracks and see the light and do something or not. But time is of the essence, Darrell.
Well, that's what we say in the book. It's like, can you please stop being embarrassed about what the world wants from Canada?
Yeah.
They want our agriculture. They want our oil and gas production. They want our minerals. They want our lumber. Maybe it is a bit hewers of wood and drawers of water, but guess what? We're not Silicon Valley North.
Exactly.
And all anybody has to do to just blow up all of this mythology is sit down and look at Canada's trade statistics.
Yeah.
What do we export? What do we make? What sectors do people work in? What drives our economy? And it's very, very obvious what does. So the question is, okay, can we have an honest conversation rather than like a philosophically, I would maybe philosophically more elevating type conversation that sometimes books that get written about values and the rest of it sometimes want to get into. But let's have a very practical conversation about the realities of what's going to make us survive. And it's the richness of the natural resources that we have to be able to get into not just the North American market, but into the global market. And the world wants what Canada has. Why don't we build what's necessary in order to make that happen? And, the luxury of people having very parochial views about these kinds of things are going to become very rapidly into focus as we realize things like the automotive industry is not going to be what it was.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is that Quebec thinks it's going to run its economy on. If it's not getting transfer payments from the federal government that are basically paid out of the fact that we have natural resources exports. So reality is going to come very quickly into focus as we start moving through this next period. And while I know building infrastructure projects, like, for example, pipelines, are incredibly difficult, the kinds of conversations we were having about it before seemed to be, what was in the economic interests of the companies that wanted to build them, and what was in the environmental interests, for example, of the groups that wanted to protest about it. It wasn't about the survival of our country, which is a different kind of conversation. And I think that's what's going to be coming more onto the table. And that very much changes the next book that I think that Mr. Carney would probably write.
Yeah, I'm sure. I know I've taken up so much of your time here, but because one of the things I really like about the book Breaking Point is that you do offer some prescriptives, but I'm just going to focus on two. So, John, to you, stop subsidizing a lame and dying media industry and subsidize consumers to support a new one. Explain.
So the last Liberal government gave us one of the world's great textbook cases of unintended consequences. They tried to shore up the traditional media, first with direct grants, and then with legislation that would require essentially Facebook and Google to pay sums of money into a fund that could then be distributed to those media. And Facebook simply said, "No, we're out of here," and they left. And so the situation is even more grim than it was before. And in any case, most of the major newspapers in Canada are wraiths of what they used to be. We talk in our book about the Ottawa Citizen, which I worked at in when I started out in 1988. There were almost 200 people in the Citizen's newsroom back then. There are only a couple of dozen people now working for the Citizen. The paper is a shadow of what it was in those days. So why are we subsidizing a remnant of something that was once much more substantial? And we argued the better way is to get rid of grants, to get rid of subsidies, to get rid of legislation, but to perhaps give tax grants or some kind of deduction to people who subscribe to any media at all, traditional, new, whatever. If you take out a subscription to something either published or online or broadcast or whatever the medium is, maybe the federal government can give you a portion of that back, and then people themselves can decide where they want their money to go in media and let the market decide.
And it also deals with that fundamental issue that I don't want people who are paid by the government covering the government and whether their behavior is good or bad. I mean, it's reputationally impossible for these folks to keep their head high.
Yeah, it's absolutely. It's perception more than reality. I mean, I worked for the Globe and Mail for 25 years. I never felt for a moment that the Globe was being pressured by anyone to write anything and was succumbing to that pressure. And I don't believe that federal grants would have any influence either. But nonetheless, people look at money going to newspapers, to broadcasters, to digital sites, and they say, well, they're not going to do a big investigation into that government, are they? Because they're relying on them to survive. So I think that both the major legacy media, the Globe, by the way, is doing very well. The networks and the new media that are emerging should be able to thrive and prosper based on their ability to attract people who pay money to read and watch what they do.
And maybe
won't that's
be
how we
penalized if they decide to do an investigative piece into all the relationships with Brookfield and
exactly so. exactly
Yeah,
so.
that's but Darrell, to you, of course, you know I'm going to do this is because we both share a passion about this, but the defense of our country and those men and women who stand up to provide it. Again, some answers there. Donald Trump has sort of said, I mean, he's forced our hand. You got to at least pay your NATO bills, boys and girls. But beyond that, he's really put it back in the spotlight again. Are we up for it? Can we spend the money that way?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, one of the themes that you'll see in the book repeatedly is, as John has just said about the media, is there's a lot of market-based solutions that we talk
Yeah,
about. That
yeah,
it's not just big government all the time, but defense is something that very much involves the government. Uh, the what we point out is that there are equipment discussions, but there's also real necessary discussions about how we actually put together a military of the future.
yeah,
And that means making sure that people are enticed into having a career in the military. Now, the prime minister, one of the first things that he's moved on in government was to up the compensation of people
yeah,
in the military. So good on him. Let's see what the effect is going to be. But the recruiting issue is going to be a big one.
yeah,
The other thing that I would say is that there's been I would say, an inordinate amount of discussion about the North.
yeah,
Whenever Canadians want to talk about the military, it's always what we're going to do in the North, since it seems to be manageable. But one of the things that we rarely talk about is, what about the military in the rest of the rest of,
yes,
and in fact, the people who are challenging us the most happen to be on our southern border, not necessarily on our northern border. So it's
exactly.
not necessarily just going to be, oh, we're going to build some more, icebreakers, and we're going to, monitor what's going on in the Arctic better. I mean, we've also got to be concerned about the security of our own border. And I'm not saying this in the sense that the Americans are going to invade, but one of the big things that Donald Trump has pointed out, and there's a lot of people who question whether or not this, how much basis in fact there is in this, but what about the security of our own border, our own
Yes,
southern
exactly.
states? What are we doing to prevent,
We've been having this conversation since 2001 and 9/11. Yeah.
well, let's focus on one that's very real, because we're seeing it all the time. Illegal guns coming over the border
Yeah.
from the United States into Canada. You want to see who's shooting, or what guns are being involved in this. Matt Gurney did a great piece on this
Yeah.
a little while ago, in which he looked at, almost all of them are the guns that are being used are coming from across the
Of course.
southern border, and
Yeah.
they're being used by gangsters in the city of Toronto. Well, we need to protect our southern border too. So the military's probably got a role in both of those areas.
Hmm.
And the idea that we could start seeing more uniforms in places other than the most remote parts of the country
Yeah.
probably is a good thing.
It's one of the problems we've got anyway, which is our bases are all hived off. And you can grow up in this country without seeing soldiers on the street, men and women. And so there is a disconnect.
And for our reservists, I think, is our citizen soldiers, the ones that I know you and I have been very intimately involved in over the years. I think all of what we're hearing is good news. And I'm hoping that what we're going to see is more support for our regiments, more support for our air squadrons that are in various parts of the country, and more support for our cement frigates, which are, like HMCS York here in the city of Toronto, but we have these things all over the place. The military presence in our community, because Canadians very much strongly support the Canadian military. This is a good thing to show them that the government is acting, that these are part of your community, and
Yeah.
that these people are going to be used to protect our interests. I think
Well,
all of that
and
is
maybe
good.
we have to stop asking them to be all things to all people, which is fight fires and deal with floods and go into old folks' homes when there's COVID, John. I mean, we maybe need to focus on what our military should be doing.
Yes, absolutely. We have often relied on the military to work in these kind of emergency situations domestically, but we have troops in Latvia,
Yeah.
mere meters away from the Russians. Those troops need to be protected, given the best possible equipment, and we need to make a meaningful contribution to our NATO allies in the north. Yes, where we are challenged by the Russians and the Chinese, and perhaps someday by the Americans, but also in Europe. especially against the Russian border. These are big obligations that we have to meet. I'm encouraged that Prime Minister Carney is committed to increasing defense spending. We'll see how that actually plays out in the budget and in the future. But we must have a voice in the world, and we're not going to have that voice unless we have a credible defense.
One of your great lines in the book, you two, Canada has survived on compromise, inertia, and a stubborn refusal to confront its contradictions. And I think your point is, the both of you, but to you, Darrell, for a final word, that time's up.
Yeah, it's a place worth saving. It's a culture worth saving. We are a unique culture on the North American continent. And if we firmly believe that, we need to act like it. And that's really what Breaking Point is. It's a cri de coeur. It's a cry to our fellow from the heart, from two patriots to our fellow Canadians to say,
Yeah.
now's the time.
I wrote those very words about your book, cri de coeur, in the Substack that we will put up at the same time as we put up our podcast here. Breaking Point, the new big shifts putting Canada at risk. And it is really, it's the one I've got here, probably an advanced copy, kind of a small book, but it's powerful. And I really do think people need to read it, but take it to heart and understand that it's on all of us. Yes, our political leaders have to act, but we have to suggest that they do, because that's how it works in this country. Darrell Bricker and John Ibbitson, thank you so much for being with me today, but also for writing it and taking the time. Keep writing all your books. You've written millions of them. Keep going.
Been a pleasure.
Thanks so much. And that is it for this edition of No Nonsense. We'll see you very soon. Thanks for joining us.